A very warm welcome to the MS podcast series on research updates. I'm Nicola Graham. I'm really delighted to have your company today, and we're looking at the fascinating topic of remyelination. So one of the key effects, as I'm sure you know well, of MS is that the myelin, the fatty tissue covering your nerves, gets damaged. So what if we could repair this myelin insulation? What if your nerves could start to work better? How good would that be? So that's what we're going to be looking at today. If you'd like to know where the research is at with remyelination, is it a pipe dream? Is it going to happen in a timely scale? Please stay tuned. I'm talking with Brett Drummond from MStranslate, and Brett's going to get us all up to date with remyelination. So really warm welcome, Brett.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. Thanks for having me, and really excited to talk about a topic that I know is of huge interest to people living with multiple sclerosis.
Yeah, it's so important. It would be great if we could actually find a treatment to reverse some of the damage. So let's jump in and find out where we're at. So, Brett, can you give us a bit of a better outline of what actually is remyelination?
Yeah, so remyelination, or myelin repair is another name that we use for it, is actually a really natural process. So I think the most important place to start is understanding that damage to myelin can happen in a number of different circumstances, not just multiple sclerosis. So if you get a concussion, if you have an infection that may get to the brain, myelin damage can occur in those circumstances as well. The difference between those circumstances and multiple sclerosis is that remyelination can happen. It's a natural process, and when we have a concussion, the myelin will just naturally repair itself. However, for reasons that are still a little bit unclear, that doesn't happen in multiple sclerosis. And so that ongoing damage to the nervous system and that lack of repair is what we see sort of leading to increased disability across the life of a person with multiple sclerosis.
Okay, thanks, Brett. And it's good to know that it's a process that happens naturally for a lot of other reasons, not just with MS. So why is remyelination of interest to people who have multiple sclerosis?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's really the next step, I think, in terms of the management of multiple sclerosis. So, where we are at the moment is that we have a number of therapies that are available for people living with multiple sclerosis, and they've become, especially the newer generation ones, have become exceptionally good at being able to stop or slow new damage from occurring to the nerves. But none of those therapies do anything to actively repair that damage after it exists. And so while we may be able to slow disability progression, and we've seen data that suggests that's certainly possible with these treatments, we're not doing anything to be able to improve symptoms necessarily. And that's where myelin repair or remyelination may step in. It's really about being able to, as you say, reverse the disease. Can we actually go backwards and see some improvement in symptoms and be able to improve the quality of life for people living with multiple sclerosis? And we often talk about a cure for multiple sclerosis, and I think that often gets thrown around, certainly in the media, every time we have a new development in the research field. And when I talk about remyelination, I talk about it as being a concept or a component of what we might be looking at for a revised version or a redefined version of a cure in MS. Because I think if we can have therapies that can stop new damage or slow new damage from occurring, which we already have, and combine that with a therapy that can repair damage that exists, then what we're seeing is a much more complete management of the disease. And while it's not a cure necessarily in terms of our traditional view of it, if we can get to that stage, I think we're getting closer to something that may be complete management.
I can see why you're excited about this subject matter, Brett. It shows some promise. So what is the research telling us about remyelination and what might be realistically possible?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing to say is that this is a huge area of research in multiple sclerosis. There are many, many, many studies going on around the world around this. And so I think to put it in context in terms of how all of these studies are looking at, it's good to think about the problem that exists to begin with, because part of what this research is doing is trying to understand that problem. We said at the start that myelin repair is very possible. It happens in lots of conditions, but it doesn't happen in multiple sclerosis. So if we think about how research groups are attacking this, it's useful to think of it in terms of an analogy. So if you think of driving to the supermarket and you have one road that connects your house to the supermarket, and one day when you go to do it, a tree's fallen down across that road. You can't get to the supermarket anymore. In a similar way, we know that myelin repair occurs through pathways. Basically, there's a series of steps that need to happen to get myelin repair to occur. Now, it's not as simple as one straight line like the analogy, but it's along those lines. Now, in terms of our analogy, in terms of getting to the supermarket, what would our potential solutions be? Well, we could try and make sure that the tree never fell in the first place. We can try and work out what caused that tree to fall, and we could stop that from happening. Or we could look at a way that we could start our journey from the other side of the tree, or we could look at a way of being able to put that tree back up or get rid of that block. And that's really what's happening in terms of the research into myelin repair. We're trying to work out what causes the block in the first place to see if we can stop that from happening. Can we reverse the block once it's there, or can we somehow jumpstart the process further down the track after the block has occurred? So because of all of this, there's many different targets that have been looking at, and we won't go through all of them in today's episode. But essentially what the research has shown, and there are many, many different studies, is that remyelination is certainly possible. Now, a lot of this has been done in animal studies, so there are a few human studies that we'll talk about in a little bit as well. But I think we can take heart from seeing that there are studies that have shown and research that has shown that myelin repair is possible. It's just a matter of working out exactly what compounds may be the best to have that happen. And there are, I think it would be safe to say, hundreds of compounds being investigated at the moment to do that. And whether or not the promising research that we see in those early animal models translates across to human clinical trials.
Out of all those different studies that are going on, Brett, which one are you following most closely, and when does that publish?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different areas that I think are of particular interest. One, there was a really interesting publication, I think it was in 2020, that came out of the University of Cambridge that looked at the use of intermittent fasting and metformin in an animal model. And so what they saw with this is that if they had mice that were on a normal diet and then mice that were having this intermittent fasting diet, the mice that were on the intermittent fasting program actually had more myelin repair. So they were given the animal model of multiple sclerosis, which is called EAE. And in those mice that were intermittent fasting, they found that their myelin repair, their ability to remyelinate those damaged nerves, was better. Now, what they wanted to see was whether or not they could replicate that with an existing drug called metformin. So metformin is a drug that's commonly given people living with diabetes. And so they thought that this drug could mimic the results that they saw with the mice that fasted. And again, in the group where they compared mice that weren't taking metformin with mice that were taking metformin, they found that those on drug had that similar improved ability to remyelinate. So this was really exciting. I think the fact that they could see it both with the dietary approach and the drug approach gives us more confidence that there is some real reason to be excited about that. And they're now pursuing that. So the University of Cambridge are in the process of starting to recruit for some early phase clinical trials. Now, that's been quite a slow process during the coronavirus pandemic. It's much harder to get people in and recruit for clinical trials during that. But we can expect that trial to start within the near future. And it'll be really interesting to see whether those really positive results are replicated in that human clinical trial. Now, there's a slight point of difference. They're purely looking at the metformin side of things. So they aren't going to be looking at the intermittent fasting in that trial. They're keen to see whether they can get the results with metformin, and they're actually going to do metformin and a separate group in that trial where it's metformin plus clemastine. Now, clemastine is a compound that's actually found in a number of over-the-counter antihistamines that was identified by a group at the University of California, San Francisco a few years ago as having potential to also remyelinate looking at the optic nerve. Actually, they did a test where they screened a number of common compounds and saw what could help repair the damage to the optic nerve in some tests, and they found that one. So the University of Cambridge are also going to be testing that.
Brett, that's really interesting, because I know from my time at Parkinson's, they'd identified a number of years ago that people on metformin fared much better with their Parkinson's condition as well. So I think a little bit of a take home there for our listeners is to keep an eye on that study, but also managing your blood sugar levels and avoiding those spikes of sugar, maybe speaking to our MS dietitian service or finding a really good dietitian is a conversation worth having as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, we know that diet in itself is a whole different topic and can have benefits for people living with multiple sclerosis, not just for their disease progression, but for a number of comorbidities. And I think the really interesting part about the metformin study and the intermittent fasting study, the reason why they looked at intermittent fasting to begin with, is that there is some suggestion that one of the problems that starts to impact myelin repair and multiple sclerosis is age, and not necessarily growing older, though that's obviously part of it, but also just the age of cells. And one of the best ways that's been found at the moment to slow the aging process is intermittent fasting. And it's thought that metformin may have a similar sort of thing. So it's interesting that they're going down that path. Yeah,
and we know with intermittent fasting as well that it produces a brain growth factor, so it can be neuroprotective for the brain. But again, a big caution, intermittent fasting is not for everybody. So please, listener, do chat with your dietitian to find out what might be appropriate to you. So Brett, it sounds really exciting. It's really interesting. We'd love to think that remyelination might be something in the very near future. What can our listeners expect to see treatment-wise, and in what time frame? It's kind of the million-dollar question, isn't it? How long?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a difficult question to answer, but it's a really important question. I mean, I think whenever we discuss these sorts of things, we want to put them into a context. We don't want people to be assuming that, this is something that's going to be available within the next 6 months. My easiest way of answering this is really to share the opinions of other people who are experts in the field, who I talk to on a regular basis. And one that people may know about if they follow MStranslate is Dr. Travis Stiles, who works for Novum Bioscience in San Diego, California. And their company is also currently looking at a compound that can promote remyelination in multiple sclerosis. And so they're working through a number of studies on that at the moment. But when I talk to him about the broader field, he thinks it's certainly feasible that we could have a successful remyelination therapy within the next 5 to 6 years. Now, it's always difficult to predict those things with certainty. And, we have no idea whether or not clinical trials will work. The clinical trial process isn't short in itself. So we need a bit of patience as we go through that. And I know that that's obviously a very difficult thing. We obviously all want this to become available as soon as possible. But, we're hopeful that it's not just something that's going to be 20 years away. I think we're thinking that hopefully it will be much shorter timeframes than that. It's interesting that there is a lot of talk at the moment in the field as well about how we can improve the clinical trials into remyelination. So we've seen the University of Cambridge study that I talked about isn't the first clinical trial that we've had in people living with multiple sclerosis for myelin repair therapies. We have had others. Anti-lingo may be one that a number of people may have heard of. There was a bexarotene study that also came out of the University of Cambridge. And these have been unsuccessful for varying reasons. So the bexarotene study out of the University of Cambridge actually showed that remyelination was possible in people living with multiple sclerosis, which was fantastic to see a human study showing remyelination work. The issue there was that the drug used produced side effects that just weren't acceptable for human use. But in other clinical trials that we've seen fail, a lot of what's been suggested is that it's a problem with trial design. And so there's certainly suggestions, and Gavin Giovannoni, who people may know of as someone who's quite big in terms of talking about this research online as well, put out a paper recently where they talked about this and suggested we really need to be thinking more carefully about how we're designing these trials, because we can't afford to waste time. People living with MS can't afford for more time to be wasted on myelin repair therapies. And one of the things that they suggested including as part of these trials is exercise, that we shouldn't just be giving people therapies and waiting to see what happens, that potentially having exercise included as part of the combined trial for these therapies is something that should be heavily considered.
That's good to be reminded of. We know how significant exercise can be, and we know particularly high intensity interval training exercise can be really good for people with MS. So encouraging people to incorporate that where possible. And I know that could be hard when people have got fatigue, but really important to have a look at. Does there seem to be a particular profile of a person, age, disability status, who might be the best candidate for remyelination, Brett?
Yeah, again, a really good question. I think the short answer to this is we probably don't have enough information yet to say one way or another whether or not that is the case. Again, in recent chats that I've had with people about this, I don't think that anyone's of the mindset that remyelination therapies will be restricted to certain people. I think that maybe there is a general thought that we will need different approaches for different people. So, while we may develop a therapy that works really well for people who are, earlier in their disease course with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, that same approach may not necessarily work for people later in the disease with a progressive form of multiple sclerosis, for example. But as I said at the start, thinking back to that tree analogy, there are many different ways that we're looking at attacking this problem. And so it may be that we end up just like we have with the immunosuppressive or immunomodulatory therapies, where we have a number of different ones that are available. And it's all about finding the one that best works for an individual. I think that shift towards personalized medicine may also be occurring in the myelin repair stage as well. And we'll hopefully end up with a number of different options, and they'll be finding the ones that work for each individual.
And Brett, from gleaming from your answer there, I'm taking it that this is a possible therapy that would be suitable for people with the different types of MS, from progressive to relapsing remitting.
Yeah, I certainly think that's the hope at this stage. There's no indication that this is something that's going to necessarily be restricted to relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. And when we're talking about damage, it's a little bit different to when we talk about the currently existing therapies, where we know that they are mostly for people with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. And that's because there's a shift in terms of what's causing the damage in relapsing remitting versus progressive multiple sclerosis. When we're talking about repairing the damage, as I said, we still don't have enough information to be able to answer it conclusively. But I certainly think there's nothing at this stage to indicate that these therapies won't be successful for progressive multiple sclerosis, or that we won't be able to find one.
And Brett, I think it's worth noting for our listeners as well that people can join clinical trials. So although a therapy might be some years away, there is the opportunity, if appropriate, for people to join clinical trials. So that's something, especially now in a more global opportunity, isn't there, to join trials?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's one of the best ways we know from talking regularly to people in the MS community, that they are heavily invested in research and want to help research as much as they can. And participating in trials and participating in studies is one of the most fantastic and generous ways that you can help research. So certainly I would encourage people to keep a lookout for what trials are available they may be eligible for. I know MS Australia and all of the state-based organisations do a great job of promoting those studies when they are available for people. So certainly monitoring those pages and keeping in contact with your neurologist and asking about those sort of things is a really good idea.
That's great. And Brett, you mentioned side effects, which stopped one of the trials. Any potential side effects of these remyelination treatments that people should be aware of, or is this a bit of premature given the treatments are a little bit away yet?
Yeah, I think that's really going to be dependent on the individual treatment. There won't be my thoughts are that there won't be a universal side effect that comes with repairing myelin. It will be dependent on the type of drug that's used for it. I guess when we talk about something like metformin, because it is something that's already been used in other diseases, we already have a relatively good idea of the safety profile for that. And so we know that it is relatively well tolerated and, the side effects are relatively minor. When we're looking at something like bexarotene, which was in that University of Cambridge study, they knew that it was quite a dirty drug, is maybe not the best choice, but it wasn't their first choice. But because it was currently available, they wanted to test it out. But yes, that did lead to quite significant side effects. So I think it's going to be different depending on the type of therapy that's used.
And that is encouraging with the metformin, because it is a drug that is currently already available. So that can help speed things along a little bit, can't it?
Yeah, definitely. I think, if it's already gone through some of those processes, then that can obviously speed up the clinical trial process and gives a bit more confidence in terms of, as I said, that safety profile.
So Brett, thank you. Thanks for bringing all your knowledge. I know this is an area, the remyelination, that you're looking at really closely and following with a lot of passion and a lot of interest. So if anything new comes up, let us know and we'll make sure we keep our listeners up to date. I always love ending our research podcast with asking you, what might the next topic be? We try to do these quarterly, so I'm really interested to think what you might want to cover next time.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting research going on at the moment. I think we've got ECTRIMS coming up towards the end of the year, but before that, certainly the diet and the gut microbiome, there's a lot of stuff going on, which we talked about in our ECTRIMS topic from last year. That's one that's interesting. Yeah. Lifestyle factors, I think, is another one that, we're seeing a lot of things around, not only just diet, but also exercise, which we've mentioned in terms of this episode, around how that may be beneficial in terms of remyelination, smoking and the negative effects of that, and all of the data that we're seeing around that. Yeah, that could be one as well. But there are so many, and we want to be as responsive as possible to what comes out that could be something that we don't even know about yet. Stem cells could be another one, actually, that we might talk about, because we didn't cover it in today's episode, but there are a different type of stem cells to the ones that we talk about that are also have potential for myelin repair, that are being looked at in early stage clinical trials as well.
Okay, well, people will have to subscribe to the podcast so they can find out what that next research update is. So thanks so much, Brett. Really love the way that you're able to take a lot of scientific information and put it into bite-sized pieces so we can really follow it and do what your organization says, which is to translate that info for us. So thanks, Brett. And so just to thank our listeners for tuning in, and encourage you to subscribe to the podcast so you can keep up to date with our research updates. And just to remind you, if you've got any MS-specific concerns or queries, if you want to speak to a nurse advisor, to a social worker, if you want some peer support, if we can help you in any way, if you'd like some NDIS support, please give us a call. We're here to support you, and our telephone number and the gateway to all of our services is via MS Connect on 1-800-042-138. Thanks for your company today, and a quick shout out to Darcy and his team at Pro Podcast Productions for their generous support. And we look forward to your company in our next podcast. Bye for now.